For the final part of this chapter, we have to talk about genetic technology in agriculture. Agriculture, by definition, is the practice of either growing crop plants or also farming animals, either to produce food or even raw materials. But most of the time, we are just focusing on the food production aspect of agriculture. Now, before we talk about how gene tech or genetic technology is used in agriculture, we kind of have to introduce some of the problems that exist in agriculture before genetic technology was a thing. One problem that crop plants can face when we are growing particular types of plants, for example, I'm just drawing a tomato plant here. That's not exactly how it looks like, but who cares? The crop plants will have to compete with weeds for water, minerals, and space. So you have your crop plant growing over here, but you also have weeds, which are these unwanted plants that will randomly appear. So the crop plants are not getting the maximum amount of water or minerals due to the presence of other species which we do not want existing. Now, another problem that crop plants may face, I'm just zooming in over here, you can see that there are pest species like caterpillars, and what may happen is the caterpillars might start chewing on the leaves, they might even eat the fruits, or they might even damage the stem of the plants. Not just caterpillars, there are many different pest species, but what can also happen is the crop plants can be damaged by pests. And obviously in that case, what happens then? The productivity of your crop plants are reduced. I do not want to buy a half-eaten tomato in the market. I mean, would you? So, and of course, the third problem that we can also have is like, for example, salmon. If you're a big fan of salmon, you have to understand that a wild salmon, the ones where you obtain from their natural habitat, they grow quite slowly. For a salmon to reach adulthood, it takes about almost 3 years. Only then we will capture the salmon to be consumed as food. But that is the problem, basically. Salmon in its wild habitat takes a very long time to reach market ready size. Market ready size just means the size that is available for us to buy and to consume. Of course, these are not the only problems that exist in agriculture, food production, but these are the three that you have to focus on in the Cambridge A-level exams. So the question here is, can we use genetic technology to solve these problems? And the answer is obviously yes, we can. So the first thing that we have to know is, how can we use genetic technology to solve the problem with the plants competing with the weeds? Before gene tech, we could also solve the problem, but it comes with a lot of side effects or negative impacts on the environment. As an example, if you see your crop plants over here, please be reminded this is before genetic technology. So when the weeds are growing and also competing with the crop plants, farmers can spray something known as herbicides. Herbicides are chemicals used to kill weeds, but here's the thing. When you spray the herbicides, it will also kill your crop plants in the process. Right? So that's a problem. You want to kill the weeds, but you do not want to kill your crop plants at the same time. Now, if you read the textbook, they do explain how the herbicides work, but you don't technically need to know the herbicide's mechanism of action. That's not important. So with gene tech, what scientists have done is they have inserted a herbicide-resistant gene into the crop plant. You don't have to know the process in detail. That gene is obtained from a particular type of bacterium known as the agrobacterium. Again, don't need to know that in detail. How they insert the gene into the plant, we don't also have to know the process in detail as well. Do not worry about that. But what happens is, when the new gene has been inserted into the plant, the crop plant that you have right now is herbicide resistant. Now, what does it mean by herbicide resistant? It means that when the farmers spray the herbicides in this case, what happens is only the weeds will die, as you can see over there, but the crop plant, because obviously they are resistant, so they are unaffected by the herbicides. Now, I'm going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of producing herbicide-resistant crop plants. This can also be used as your answer in the ethics of developing herbicide-resistant crop plants. Now, the advantage obviously is as follows. When you are able to kill the weeds effectively and allow your crop plants to live, the plants will have no competition, less to no competition with weeds. Therefore, there will be increased productivity of your crop plants. And when there's increased productivity of the crop plants, there's more food available for people, and there are also better profit margins for the farmers because they are able to produce more. In this case, they are able to produce more tomato plants. But there are some disadvantages here. The disadvantages that you must also know is farmers will tend to overuse herbicides. They get a bit too trigger happy with the herbicides because the crop plants are not going to be affected by the chemicals, so farmers just go all out spraying a lot of herbicides into the farmland. Now you might be thinking, why is that such a big deal? Because we are killing the weeds, that's what we want to do, so the more herbicides we spray, the better. It does come with a problem though, because as you can see here, some of the weeds have died. The weeds have died off, so that's fine. Now, I told you that weeds can randomly grow. All right, it's an unavoidable process. Especially if you do a bit of gardening in your own home, you will notice that after a few days of just de-weeding, like pulling out all those small little plants, they'll tend to grow after a few days as well. So weeds are just something that randomly can appear. So when new weeds grow, some students will think, well, if new weeds appear, just spray herbicides again, just repeat the process. Here's the problem. Yes, the weeds may die, and again the process repeats itself, new weeds grow. But what if randomly one day, one of the weeds underwent mutation? It's not that it undergoes mutation deliberately, it's a random process. And it so happens that because of the mutation, the weeds are now resistant. And I'm going to represent the weeds as a red color. It's not actually red in color, but I'm just going to put one as a red in color. If you're colorblind, don't worry, it's the one that I've just circled over there. So now, you have most of the weeds are non-resistant to herbicides, but one of the weeds, because it is resistant, what happens when you spray the herbicide? When you spray the herbicides, yes, it's fine. Most of the weeds will die, except the herbicides will now act as a selection pressure. What does it mean by acting as a selection pressure? In this case, due to the herbicides, some of the weeds, in this case, that one lone weed right there, that one survives as well because it is resistant to the herbicide. So the herbicide-resistant weed plant will survive, and when they survive, what happens during natural selection? They will reproduce. So the future population of weeds in your farm are now all herbicide-resistant. So the act of using herbicides will ironically eventually lead to a large population of weeds in the area, which are herbicide resistant. It's kind of the same if you remember when we studied in chapter 17, selection and evolution. I told you that overusing antibiotics will eventually lead to antibiotic resistant bacteria. It's the same thing over here as well. The overuse of herbicides to kill weeds will eventually lead to a population of herbicide resistant weeds that may happen due to the random mutation of the weeds. All it just takes is for one of the weed plant to mutate, and then you have a big problem. So now when you spray the herbicides, the weeds are not dying, your crop plant is not dying, and you're back to square one where they are all competing for water and minerals. So the overusage of herbicides in this case will eventually allow weeds to evolve and become herbicide resistant. That's the first problem. The second disadvantage is your genetically modified plant can also become a weed in another farm. I need to explain this part. Okay, let's imagine two farms. Farm A grows tomato plants and Farm B grows cabbages. And Farm A, the farmer has herbicide-resistant genetically modified tomato plants. And for Farm B, the farmer has herbicide-resistant genetically modified cabbages. Fine. So anytime let's look at the farm over here in Farm B. Anytime the farmer has small little weeds growing over there, you can see that I'm just drawing it. What happens? All the farmer has to do is the farmer just has to take the spray, herbicide, spray it, and it kills the weeds. But what if accidentally one of the genetically modified tomato plant accidentally grows in farm B? And let's say a few of them grows in farm B. When the farmer tries to spray the tomato plant will not die, because why? The tomato plant is herbicide resistant. Now you might be thinking, what's the big deal? The farmer now has cabbages and tomatoes at the same time, but the farmer's like, no, I do not want fucking tomatoes. I want cabbages only. So in this case, the tomato plant becomes a weed in the cabbage farm. And that's a big problem. Of course, you can argue all the farmer has to do is the farmer just has to pull out tomato plants that are invading the area. But imagine if the field is extremely big, then the farmer will have to consume a lot of time manually pulling out the weeds instead of being able to spray them and kill them with the herbicides. So that's an issue as well. So in this case here, the genetically modified crop plant may become a weed in another farm where they are not wanted. Third problem or third disadvantage is the genetically modified plant may interbreed with a wild relative. Now, why is it a problem if it breeds with a wild relative? So you have your genetically modified tomato plant over here. I use tomato as an example, but it can apply to any crop plant. Now, tomato plants actually come from a particular family known as the nightshade family. Again, you don't need to memorize that. But the nightshade family also has wild relatives which exist in the wild, and they are weeds. So I'm just going to draw it out over here. As you can see, your tomato plant, the tomato plant that we've cultivated looks extremely different from their wild varieties. Here, the weird thing is, even though they may be different species, they might be closely related. And the annoying thing about plant is they are able to easily interbreed with a wild relative of different species. Now you might be thinking, why is this such a big deal? Because if it interbreeds, it will produce a hybrid, which is neither, you don't want the hybrid, because the hybrid tomato plant is not what you want. You want plants which are tall and produce big juicy red tomatoes, but this hybrid sucks at doing so. So obviously, number one, you don't want the hybrid, but number two, you have a problem. The hybrid may have characteristics of the genetically modified tomato plant. It might receive alleles from the genetically modified tomato plants. One of the most egregious alleles that it may receive is the herbicide resistant allele. And if it receives the herbicide resistant allele, this hybrid, which the farmer doesn't want, cannot be killed using herbicides. That's an issue. So you have a weed plant here that is produced accidentally through interbreeding, and the plant cannot be killed using herbicides at all. So the genetically modified plant might interbreed with a wild relative and produce hybrid weeds which are herbicide resistant. Last but not least, one of the ethical conundrums when it comes to herbicide resistant crop plant is the fact that genetically modified crop plant seeds, the genetically modified seeds, are expensive. The farmers are required to buy it from the company that manufactures these plants, and they have to buy it every harvest cycle. They cannot just reuse the seeds of the plants that they obtained from the first harvest cycle. So it will cause a dent in the farmer's profit, and it will actually dip into their spending too. So it might also cause less profit margins for the farmers. So yes, the advantage is they can produce more food and they may get profits, but they have to spend more to get the seeds. So that's another issue with herbicide resistant crop plants. One of the problems that we also mentioned was the crop plants being damaged by pests. So what we can do is we can actually produce something known as pest-resistant crop plants. So before genetic technology was a thing, if pests were causing damage on the crop plants, farmers can spray something known as pesticides. Pesticides are chemicals used to kill the pest. Herbicides kill plants or weeds. Pesticides kill pests. Okay, so and when the pests die, you might be thinking, oh, that's not a bad thing, and there's less damage on the plants. But again, it may cause harmful side effects, or there can be some negative impacts. Number one, pesticides can be expensive. The farmers will have to spend more money. And number two, pesticides have this annoying habit of also killing non-pest species. For example, bees. Bees are harmless in the whole thing, but because you're spraying it, the bees that are caught in the splash damage will also die in the process, and we don't want bees to die because bees are natural pollinators. So with genetic technology, what the scientists will do is insert something known as the Bt toxin gene into the embryo of the plant, and then the plant will develop, and that plant will then become a genetically modified pest-resistant crop plant. And how are they pest resistant? They are able to produce something known as Bt toxin. So what exactly is Bt toxin? Bt toxin is just a particular toxin that when the pest tries to eat the plant, the Bt toxin will enter the pest's body and the pest will die. The insects will die in this case. Now, some students will immediately say, okay, that's fine, that's good, but what if I eat the tomato plant that has Bt toxin? Will I die? The answer is no. So we don't have to worry about it. Right? It is only specifically harmful to certain species of insects, and that's the good thing. Only the insects will die in this case. And do we have to actually spray the pesticides anymore to reduce the damage? No, we don't have to, because the plants are able to naturally produce its own pesticides to kill the insects. So that's fantastic. So in this case, what's the advantage? The ethical side of this, it's increased production of crop plants. Same thing, more food for the people, better profits for the farmers because there's less damage. And also one of the advantages, there's less pesticide usage. So when you use less pesticides, you don't have to spray the chemicals anymore, right? Less cost on the farmer. And of course, one of the important things also is the non-pest species are usually not killed, so it will reduce damage on butterflies and bees, which are not technically damaging the plants. So that's good. However, it also comes with its own fair share of problems. Pest-resistant crop plants produce Bt toxins, which can act as a selection pressure to allow pests to evolve and become toxin resistant. Sounds like a mouthful. Let's explain this. So what happens first is, yes, the plants are producing Bt toxin. This is a genetically modified pest-resistant crop plant. The Bt toxin kills the pest. More pests come towards the plant and try to damage the plant. All it takes is for one of the pests to mutate. And if it mutates in such a way that makes it Bt toxin resistant. So what happens is the Bt toxin acts as a selection pressure, and I've represented it as a red color pest which is mutated. So when the Bt toxin acts as a selection pressure, what does that mean? If that pest eats the plant, will it die? Yes, it will die because it's not resistant. What about the second one? If it eats it, it will die as well, and it's also because it's not resistant. But that one that I've circled, when it eats the plant, it will not die because, like I said, it is no longer resistant to the Bt toxin. And when that one survives, it will continue to reproduce. And when it reproduces, most, if not all, of the pests which are eating the plants are all Bt toxin resistant. So it's the irony. Same thing. Remember when we talked about the herbicide? Overusing the herbicides will produce herbicide resistant weeds eventually. Overproduction of Bt toxin in the plants will eventually lead to Bt toxin resistant pests. So it's no longer effective to kill the pests. Number two, what may also happen is, I told you as well that the pest resistant crop plants can become weeds in other farms. Is the same concept as well that I've mentioned earlier, based on like if this particular plant grows in another farm, it becomes a weed, and that can be difficult to be killed. And number three, your genetically modified plant can interbreed with a wild relative, and when it breeds with a wild relative, you can have problems. For example, you have your tomato plant here, which is your pest resistant plant. It produces Bt toxin. it reproduces with a wild relative. It produces a hybrid weed that the farmers don't want, and that hybrid weed produces Bt toxin. Why is that a problem? The insects cannot remove the weeds by eating them anymore, and therefore you have a hybrid weed that is also pest resistant. So those weeds will also grow and thrive quite effectively. And number 4, I did mention genetically modified seeds are expensive for the same reason that I've mentioned earlier. So these are some of the ethics when it comes to the pest-resistant crop plants, the advantages and also the disadvantages. And finally, what we have to cover is we have to talk about genetically modified animals. More in particular, we want to talk about salmon. Okay. Now, before gene tech, young salmon only produces growth hormones intermittently. Intermittently meaning to say they only produce growth hormones during specific time periods. For example, they only produce it during spring and summer. So only during spring and summer they will grow, right? So that is why it takes a period of at least 3 years to reach its adult size, where we can catch the salmon and be suitable for human consumption. 3 years is a long time to wait for salmon. Now, with gene technology, however, the scientists will put something known as a growth hormone regulating gene into the embryo. They will also put a suitable promoter inside. You don't have to go into the detail of this, just understand it. The point is, it produces a genetically modified young salmon because now it has extra genes and promoters. And this salmon, instead of producing growth hormones intermittently, which is only spring and summer, it will produce growth hormones constantly. So all throughout the year, it will produce growth hormones. And what's the effect of that when they produce more growth hormones? Obviously, they are able to reach their adult size much faster. In fact, they are able to reach their adult size at 18 months, which is about 1.5 years. So half the amount of time taken for a natural young salmon to reach the adult size, a genetically modified young salmon can do it in half that amount of time. Now, the advantages: faster production of food for humans. Disadvantages, like if you notice I put ... question mark, I guess you can call it a disadvantage. We are not exactly sure if the genetically modified salmon will outcompete the wild salmon in the wild. So what happens if you put the genetically modified salmon to live together with the wild salmon? Will it cause any problems? We don't know. Is it ethical to genetically modify animals? That's another issue as well. Number 3, consumption of genetically modified animals. We are unsure whether it may cause allergic reactions or harm to the human body in the long run. These are some of the possible disadvantages. Not really a disadvantage, but we are just worried with these kind of questions when we are talking about the ethics of genetically modified animals. So with that being said, we are finally done with chapter 19 of the Cambridge A-Levels syllabus.